The secret reason you keep failing isn't bad luck, a curse, or a flaw in your ambition. It's the condition of the ground you are pouring your life into. Eliazar knew nothing of spiritual metaphor. He only understood the raw, painful reality of the dust. He stood on the edge of his field, the sun a molten coin setting over the Sea of Galilee, painting the sparse hills crimson and gold. But the colors mocked him. His gaze was fixed not on the beauty, but on the skeletal remains of his spring planting. The stalks were brittle, twisted into knots of brown wire, having offered up only the barest, premature whisper of grain before shriveling under the relentless heat and, he believed, a relentless divine judgment. This was the third consecutive year. The previous two had been lean, but this year was catastrophic. He had mortgaged the last of his family's silver, borrowed against the hope that this one field, this ancestral plot, would finally repay the decade of famine that had haunted his life since his father's passing. He reached down, and the soil beneath his fingertips was not the rich, yielding loam of memory, but a fine, unforgiving powder, punctuated by sharp, white stones, shale that surfaced every time he dug deeper than a hand's breadth. The desperation was a physical weight in his chest, heavy as the millstone he could no longer afford to turn. He wasn't just a failed farmer. He was a failing man, defined entirely by the barrenness of his efforts. The whispered accusations of his neighbors, the weary silence of his wife, Miriam, who had stopped asking when things would get better, all coalesced into a single, damning verdict. Eliazar was cursed. He worked harder than anyone. He rose before the dawn, coaxed water from reluctant, shallow wells, and meticulously scattered the expensive seed, often going hungry himself so the seed could be nourished. Yet, his neighbor, Reuben, a lazy, grumbling man, always seemed to pull enough grain to feed his growing family. Why did tireless effort yield dust, while grudging labor produced sustenance? This wasn't economics. This was cosmic unfairness. Eliazar's failure was an existential wound. He didn't just worry about surviving the winter. He worried about the meaning of his existence. If he poured his soul into the earth and received only mockery in return, what did that say about the value of his soul? He looked down at his hands, calloused and cracked, evidence of a life spent in brutal honesty with the land. Yet the land had betrayed him. He felt trapped in a loop. The harder he struggled to claw back what he lost, the faster the remaining ground slipped away. It was a failure cycle he couldn't break, a hidden mechanism of defeat that seemed impervious to effort or prayer. The secret reason, he concluded in that moment of deepening twilight, was a flaw woven into the fabric of his very being, a spiritual blight that tainted everything he touched, ensuring that every seed of hope he planted would inevitably perish. The silence in Eliazar's small house was louder than any shouting match. Miriam moved with practiced, quiet efficiency, patching the worn sackcloth, preparing the meager supper of flatbread and olives that tasted increasingly of debt and regret. Eliazar sat brooding by the cold hearth. His father, blessed be his memory, had been known throughout the region for the quality of his crops. He remembered fields of wheat so tall and dense they looked like a golden sea surging toward the horizon. His father had taught him the careful timing of the rains, the necessity of deep plowing, and the blessing of patience. He had inherited the land and the knowledge, yet the blessing had evaporated the moment the deed was passed to him. The land, once generous, now seemed to hold its bounty captive, punishing him specifically. He replayed the memory of the elders, their hands resting heavy on his shoulder when he took ownership, their eyes full of expectation. He had failed those expectations entirely. He was not merely failing himself. He was failing the memory of the dead and the future of his household. The shame was suffocating. Reuben, his neighbor, offered him patronizing advice whenever they met at the communal well. Eliazar, perhaps you water too much or too little, or maybe your soil is just tired. You need to let it rest. Rest meant starvation. He couldn't afford rest. The external pressures translated into internal chaos. Every morning he woke up and the first thought was the debt, followed by the image of the hard ground. He had tried everything. Rotating crops, hauling richer earth from distant ravines, even offering expensive sacrifices at the synagogue. Nothing worked. The land was cursed. But maybe the curse wasn't in the soil. Maybe the curse was in the way he looked at the soil. He looked at the hard, gray stones cropping up again and again, the very stones he spent weeks clearing before every planting, and he saw only obstruction. He didn't see that the stones were a symptom of a deeper problem. The ground itself lacked depth. He worked the surface, throwing hopeful seed onto ground that hadn't been truly prepared for reception. He was terrified of digging too deep, of uncovering something worse than failure, of uncovering the truth about himself. He was afraid to find that the barrenness wasn't a punishment from God, but a reflection of his own unprepared heart, obsessed with external appearances and paralyzed by the fear of poverty. The sheer volume of his effort blinded him to the futility of his method. He was planting seed meant for deep, fertile earth onto a thin, stony crust, convinced that brute force alone could compel the earth to yield. The whispers started subtly, carried on the market breeze from the shores of Capernaum. They spoke of a rabbi, not one of the learned men from Jerusalem, but a humble carpenter's son from Nazareth. He didn't debate the fine points of the Mosaic law. He spoke of the kingdom of heaven in simple stories, parables about vineyards, lost coins, and fathers waiting for wayward sons. Initially, Eliazar dismissed it as pious nonsense. He needed practical answers. Better irrigation, cheaper grain, or perhaps even a miracle worker who could make the stones vanish. He did not need philosophy, but as the despair deepened and the creditor's demands grew sharper, Eliazar realized he had nothing left to lose. He decided to seek out this Yeshua, not as a spiritual seeker, but as a desperate man looking for a technician. Surely, a man who commanded such attention must possess some practical wisdom, some secret knowledge of the land, or the weather, or maybe even the divine favor that Eliazar lacked. It was a pilgrimage born of cold, rational calculation, not faith. He told Miriam he was going to buy winter provisions, hiding the true nature of his journey. He set out before dawn, taking the long, dusty road toward the lake. Every step was a negotiation with his pride. He, the son of the revered farmer, Elimelech, now reduced to chasing rumors of itinerant preachers. The road was difficult, winding through dry gullies and past fields that, while not abundantly rich, at least showed signs of life. The contrast stung him. He saw a shepherd guiding his flock and envied the simplicity of his task. At least sheep produced wool and meat. Farming, for Eliazar, had become an engine of humiliation. He walked for 2 days, sleeping rough under the indifferent stars, his body aching, his mind churning with a relentless inventory of his mistakes. He considered the cost of the journey. Time away from his failed fields, the risk of missing a chance rain shower, however unlikely. But the greatest cost was admitting his defeat. He was traveling to ask a stranger for the secret of success, a secret his own father had possessed and passed down, yet which Eliazar had somehow lost in the translation. The deeper he walked, the more he wrestled with the feeling that he was spiritually hollow, ready to receive any instruction, but only if it guaranteed a quantifiable, visible return. He was seeking a quick fix, a spell to remove the curse, oblivious to the fact that the greatest harvest required the longest, most patient preparation, a truth he was structurally unwilling to embrace. When Eliazar finally arrived at the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, near where the fishing boats clustered beneath the town of Capernaum, the sight was overwhelming. He had expected a small gathering, perhaps a handful of scholars debating in the shade. Instead, he found a sprawling, vibrant chaos. Hundreds, perhaps 1,000 people, lined the rocky beach, fishermen mending nets, tax collectors loitering suspiciously, the sick and the lame lying pathetically in the dust, and families clustered together, their faces turned toward the water. A fishing boat, borrowed from one of the local fishermen, was pulled a short distance from the shore. In it stood Yeshua. His voice, though not loud, carried with startling clarity across the water, amplified by the natural acoustics of the cove. Eliazar was immediately jostled by the press of the crowd. He was an outsider here, a dusty hill farmer among coastal townsfolk. He felt instantly insignificant. his personal crisis swallowed by the vast collective hunger of the multitude. He couldn't even get close to the water's edge. He was forced to stand behind a group of boisterous young men who were more interested in scoffing at the preacher's humble attire than hearing his words. Yet the atmosphere was electric. There was an authority in the way the man spoke, a quiet confidence that pierced the noise and confusion. Eliazar found himself straining to hear, not wanting to miss the crucial piece of technical advice he had journeyed so far to acquire. He watched the man gesture gently toward the hills, his movements fluid and unhurried, contrasting sharply with the anxious energy of the crowd. Eliazar was ready to jot down the secret formula, the specific blend of ash and manure, the correct phase of the moon for planting, whatever secret terrestrial knowledge this renowned teacher possessed. He had brought a small wax tablet, worn and ready. He felt a fleeting surge of hope, sharp and fragile, like thin glass. He told himself, "If this fails, then I truly am finished. This is my last planting of hope." He watched as Yeshua paused, his eyes sweeping over the multitude, seeming to rest momentarily on Eliazar's anxious face before beginning to speak. The sun was high now, beating down mercilessly, and Eliazar felt the familiar sensation of sweat and dust stinging his eyes. He leaned against a rough stone wall, bracing himself against the inevitable disappointment, but clinging to the faint possibility that this man, who spoke so easily to thousands, could somehow solve the riddle of one broken man and his barren field. The stage was set, the teacher waiting for silence, the student cynical and desperate, ready only for practical instruction, completely unprepared for the lesson that would change everything. And then the rabbi spoke, beginning not with a pronouncement on the law or a healing miracle, but with a story about farming, the very occupation that was killing Eliazar slowly. "Listen, behold, a sower went out to sow." Yeshua began, his voice calm and rhythmic, weaving a simple image that every person in the crowd understood instantly. Eliazar immediately stiffened, his professional judgment rising up in protest. "A sower went out to sow," he scoffed internally. Of course he did, but which seed? And when? He quickly realized this was not a technical lecture. As the parable unfolded, Eliazar grew increasingly agitated. The sower scattered the seed, heedless of the ground. And as he sowed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Eliazar almost snorted aloud. What kind of incompetent sower threw good, precious seed directly onto a hard-packed footpath? It was wasteful, foolish, and deeply impractical. Yet, he continued to listen, compelled by the sheer simplicity of the narrative. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Eliazar's heart gave a sickening lurch. Rocky ground, no depth of soil. This described his own field perfectly. He felt a sudden, cold clarity that was frightening. He had often celebrated the rapid, early growth of his wheat, only to watch it collapse spectacularly when the summer heat arrived. Was this story meant for him? He pushed the thought away. It was just a coincidence. The rabbi continued. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Eliazar thought of his unrelenting debt, the constant worry, the anxiety that squeezed the joy and life out of every small blessing. Were those the thorns? Finally, the rabbi spoke of the good soil, which yielded a harvest 30, 60, or 100-fold. When the story ended, the crowd muttered in confusion. It wasn't a healing. It wasn't a political statement. It was just a strange story about poor farming technique. Eliazar felt immense frustration. He had wasted days for this cryptic metaphor. He looked at his worn wax tablet, still blank. The secret reason for his failure had not been revealed, merely masked in a seemingly flawed farming allegory. Yet, the image of the rapid growth on the shallow, rocky soil refused to leave him. He had mistaken quick results for true success. He thought about the pressure he felt to succeed quickly and how that pressure prevented him from doing the long, patient work required for true, lasting growth. He realized, with a sudden, startling pang, that the parable wasn't describing incompetent farming. It was describing incompetent living. He wondered, are we defined by our failures, or are our failures merely preparation for a different kind of harvest? One that is deeper and more meaningful than we first imagined? When you look back at your biggest setbacks, the projects that collapsed, the relationships that withered, do you see obstacles that cursed you, or instruments that were preparing your inner soil? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let us know how failure guided you, because Eliazar was about to discover that the failure itself was the crucial guidepost he had been desperately seeking. As the rabbi concluded with the perplexing phrase, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear," the mass of people began to churn, many walking away disappointed, feeling that the teaching had been obscure and irrelevant. Eliazar, driven by the nagging familiarity of the rocky ground mentioned in the story, found himself unable to move. He saw a small group of the rabbi's inner circle, Peter, James, and a few others, huddling near the boat, their expressions equally perplexed. Eliazar, positioning himself behind a thick clump of reeds, strained to listen as they questioned their teacher privately. "Why do you speak to them in parables?" one asked. Yeshua's response was unexpected, shifting the narrative entirely from the sower to the listener. He explained that parables conceal truth from those who merely look but do not see, and reveal truth to those whose hearts are prepared to receive it. He then began to interpret the story, and every word was like a chisel striking the hard, stony path of Eliazar's soul. The seed, he explained, was the word of God, the teaching, the truth, the opportunities for growth and change. The sower was indifferent to the ground, scattering hope everywhere, without prejudice. The failure, therefore, was never in the seed or the sower. The failure lay entirely in the ground, the receptivity of the heart. Eliazar felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. The secret reason he kept failing was revealed. It wasn't divine wrath. It was internal resistance. He had always blamed external forces, the climate, the soil quality, the debt collectors, or bad luck. But the rabbi was telling him that the failure originated from the very core of his being, the condition of his soul, which functioned as the vessel for all life's opportunities. He was the hard path, cynical, rigid, allowing fleeting worries and surface anxieties to consume hope before it could even penetrate. He was the rocky soil, full of shallow enthusiasm, quick to start a new project or embrace a fleeting resolution, but lacking the true depth needed to withstand the inevitable trials, the scorching sun. And most damningly, he was the thorny ground, overwhelmed by the crushing cares of the world, the deceitfulness of riches, and the desire for other things. His relentless pursuit of wealth and security had choked out all the good intentions and wisdom he had ever received, leaving him spiritually suffocated and yielding nothing of lasting value. The realization was devastating because it stripped away his ability to blame anyone else. The barrenness of his field was simply a mirror reflecting the barrenness of his prepared heart. He hadn't been cursed. He had been stubbornly, blindly resistant to the very conditions required for life to flourish. The rabbi detailed the 3 types of failure with a painful accuracy that felt surgical to Eliazar. The first failure, the hard path, was the failure of attention. The seed lay exposed, unreceived, easily snatched away by the birds. The fleeting distractions, the instant cynicism that dismisses truth because it doesn't align with comfortable preconceptions. Eliazar recognized this instantly. How many times had he dismissed good advice from his elders or quiet counsel from his wife, simply because it didn't promise instant, measurable results? His pride had paved over the natural softness of his spirit, creating an impenetrable pathway where hope was merely trodden underfoot. The second failure, the rocky ground, was the failure of depth. These were the ones who received the word with joy, the rapid, initial enthusiasm that Eliazar felt every spring planting. He remembered the exuberance of watching the first green shoots appear, believing that this time he had solved the riddle. But true commitment requires digging down, removing the bedrock, the deep historical obstacles, the resentment, the fear, the inherited traumas that prevent the roots from taking hold. Eliazar had always skimmed the surface. Removing the stones was arduous, unending labor, and he preferred to ignore them, hoping the superficial topsoil would suffice. It never did. The scorching sun of trial, the drought, the debt demands, the illness, always exposed his lack of foundation, causing everything to wither just when sustenance was most needed. The third and perhaps most insidious failure, the thorny ground, was the failure of priority. These hearts had depth and intention, but they allowed the worries of this world, the relentless, creeping anxiety about what if I don't succeed, to become the dominant plants in the garden of their soul. The seed of true life, the word of truth, attempted to grow, but the thorns grew faster, stealing the water and sunlight, choking out the nascent harvest. For Eliazar, the thorns were the debt and the status. His failure was not just financial. His entire sense of self-worth was tied up in the size of his harvest. He wasn't seeking yield for sustenance. He was seeking yield for validation. This obsession was the thorn bush that had drawn the life out of every good intention, every moment of gratitude, every instance of genuine affection he might have felt for his family or his work. The crushing realization was that the thorns were not planted by his enemies. They were nourished by his own anxieties and misplaced desires. His constant worry about failure had become the very mechanism that guaranteed it. The very thing he sought, security and success, was the thing that choked his soul, leaving him perpetually empty-handed and desperate. Eliazar realized the terrifying cost of the thorns. They weren't just the large, noticeable problems like debt or looming poverty. They were the small, constant preoccupations that subtly shifted focus away from what mattered. The deceitfulness of riches, as Yeshua had called it, wasn't just about desiring vast wealth. It was about believing that any amount of money or possession could solve the fundamental problems of the heart. Eliazar had believed, with religious fervor, that if he just had one spectacular harvest, his shame would lift, his marriage would mend, and his relationship with God would be restored. This belief was the thorn. It poisoned his actions, transforming honest labor into avaricious striving. He had treated the earth not as a partner, but as a reluctant slave, demanded a return based solely on his input, forgetting that life, true life, is a gift, and a gift can only thrive in a state of gratitude and openness. He saw now how his fear manifested as rigidity, how his anxiety became the thorny tangle around his soul. When Miriam suggested they sell a small piece of land to pay down the most pressing debt, thus easing the psychological burden, he had refused vehemently, convinced that holding on to the asset was the key to future success, even though the anxiety of the debt was destroying their present reality. That refusal was a thorn. When Reuben had needed help mending a fence, Eliazar had refused, calculating that the time spent was time lost on his own failing crops. That refusal, rooted in competitive envy and fear, was another thorn, one that ensured he remained isolated and hard-hearted. The thorns ensured that even when he received a moment of grace, a quiet piece of wisdom, or a loving gesture, it was immediately smothered by the immediate, overwhelming demands of his self-imposed struggle for material survival. He hadn't failed because he wasn't strong enough. He failed because he was too distracted. He was planting seeds of life and nourishing plants of worry simultaneously, and the weeds always won because they required no effort to grow, only neglect of the vital things. The secret reason for his failure was not that he sought too little, but that he sought the wrong things with a desperation that was spiritually corrosive, turning the good soil of his potential into a field choked with the fear of want. Eliazar did not return to his field expecting a miracle of instant growth or sudden rainfall. He returned to his small, silent home determined to perform the labor of repentance, which, he realized, was simply the excruciating long-term work of turning the soil. He began his journey back, not with the hurried, desperate energy of his outward trip, but with the quiet, measured pace of a man committed to slow, deep change. He knew the harvest was months away, perhaps even years, but the immediate work was his heart. When he arrived home, Miriam met him with her usual weary silence. Instead of plunging into complaints or projections of despair, Eliazar spoke simply. He apologized. He didn't apologize for the bad harvest. He apologized for the hardness of his heart, for his anxiety that had created a wall between them, and for the way his shame had turned into bitter resentment. Miriam wept, a reaction that startled him, realizing how long she had carried the burden alone. The next morning, Eliazar walked out to his field, but he carried no seed. He carried his heaviest mattock and a clear resolve. He walked to the section he knew was the shallowest, the most prone to the rocky ground. This was the place where the sprouts came quickest and died fastest. He began to dig, not just shallow furrows, but deep, back-breaking trenches. He pulled out stones the size of his head, stones his father had left, stones he had refused to address, hiding them in piles at the edge of the field. This work was harder than planting, harder than harvesting, because it offered no immediate reward, only sweat and aching muscles. He worked for days, removing the literal and metaphorical obstacles. He found satisfaction in the sheer brutality of the effort, knowing that every stone removed was a stone that could no longer hide the truth or stunt the root growth. He saw Reuben passing by on the track, and instead of averting his eyes in shame, Eliazar raised his hand and offered a simple, genuine greeting. He even asked Reuben's advice on the best way to compost the brush, opening himself up to vulnerability and community, rather than retreating into proud isolation. He realized that the first steps toward a true, meaningful harvest were the preparation of the soil, removing the cynicism, the path, pulling out the deep, hidden resistance, the rocks, and clearing the suffocating grip of worry and envy, the thorns. The labor was slow, continuous, and unglamorous. It was the sustained commitment to depth over spectacle. He was learning that the secret of success wasn't in the quality of the seed he threw, but in the quality of the ground he stood on, both literally and spiritually. He was tilling his soul, preparing for a harvest of peace, regardless of the yield. The winter passed with a quiet gravity Eliazar had never known. The cold was still harsh, the cupboard still sparse, but the internal storm had subsided. He continued the slow, meticulous work of improving his ground. He didn't pray for a miracle harvest. He prayed for the strength to continue the back-breaking labor of turning the soil, to remain patient, and to trust in the process of preparation. He learned that meaning was not found in the outcome, but in the integrity of the effort. When the planting season finally arrived, Eliazar planted the seed with a heart dramatically different from previous years. There was no feverish desperation, no demand for an instant return, only quiet hope and the profound satisfaction of having done his part by preparing the ground properly. He planted knowing that failure might still come. Droughts were real, pests were inevitable. But this time, failure would not destroy him, because his worth was no longer tied to the outcome. His peace was rooted in the quality of his character, which was now deeper, cleared of many of the thorns and rocks that had previously defined him. His field did not miraculously burst forth into impossible abundance. The yield was modest, better than the previous 3 years, enough to cover his most immediate debts and sustain his family through the winter. It was a harvest of survival, but more importantly, it was a harvest of meaning. He realized that the good soil was not a magical, perfect plot. It was simply the heart that was prepared, the one that had done the hard, honest work of accepting truth, the path, committing deeply, the rocks, and prioritizing rightly, the thorns. The parables weren't formulas for instantaneous success. They were descriptions of reality. The purpose of life wasn't to avoid failure. It was to use the inevitable failures to continually till and improve the condition of the receiving ground. He stood in his field that autumn, the late sun warming the remaining stubble, and felt a gratitude that transcended the financial return. He looked across at Reuben's slightly fuller fields and felt no envy, only a quiet acknowledgement of the abundance they shared. Eliazar finally understood the secret reason for his past failures. He had been trying to reap a harvest before he was willing to truly prepare the ground of his own soul. And he realized that the true, forgotten parable wasn't about farming at all. It was about defining success not by the height of the stalks, but by the depth of the roots. The meaning of his life was found not in the great yield he demanded, but in the profound, sustaining peace that came from simply being good soil. If this story touched your heart and offered you a moment of quiet reflection, please consider subscribing to Shoreline Parables and join us again as we explore the forgotten lessons that bring inspiration and healing to the troubled waters of life.